My name is Sophie, and I run a small bakery on the corner of a quiet street in town. It's a place I've poured my heart into, and it's become my sanctuary away from the noise and routine of everyday life. Every day started the same. I unlocked the door, switched on the lights, prepared the dough, and preheated the oven. The comforting scent of fresh bread and pastries soon filled the air. For a moment, I could forget about the things weighing me down. But today, something was different. Ethan, my husband, had long buried himself in his work. We barely saw each other anymore. He'd leave early in the morning and return late at night. On the nights when I worked late at the bakery, we didn't even get the chance to exchange a greeting. I tried not to dwell on it, focusing on my baking and the satisfied customers. Still, the emptiness and unspoken loneliness always lingered, just beneath the surface. The sound of the bakery doorbell rang, and instinctively, I looked up and walked over. There stood an old friend of my sister Isla, someone I hadn't seen in years. I remembered him as a teenager, awkward and always carrying a book. Now, he stood before me as a grown man, confident and self-assured, and for a brief moment, a strange sensation washed over me. "Hey, Sophie," he said with a smile. "It's been a while." I nodded, caught off guard, and a little flustered. Why was he here? What had brought him to the bakery? But I smiled anyway, trying to mask my discomfort. "You've changed so much," I said, trying to steady my voice. "What brings you to town?" "I came back for work," he replied. "Thought I'd swing by and relive some memories." He glanced around the bakery, then added, "It's really cozy here." "Thanks, I said. "Would you like some coffee? I just baked some fresh croissants." He agreed, and I poured him a cup of coffee. As he took in the surroundings, he told me he'd recently returned from Europe, where he'd worked at an art gallery for several years. His eyes lit up when he spoke about his latest project here in town. Just then, I noticed the flower box by my table tipping over. I tried to catch it, but the weight was too much. Caleb, my sister's old friend, stepped forward and helped me steady it. Our hands brushed, and my heart skipped a beat. He looked into my eyes, and I saw something new there, something different from before. And his eyes, once boyish and playful, now held a deeper gaze. "Are you okay?" His voice was lower than I'd expected. "Yes, thank you," I replied, feeling my cheeks heat up. I tried to pull away, but Caleb didn't let go of my hand. Instead, he gently pressed it against his. His eyes, once sparkling with mischief, grew serious. Slowly, he leaned in as if he had something important to say. And then, out of nowhere, his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft, almost playful, as though he was testing the waters. But there was something more to it, a spark that made me freeze in place, unable to pull away. I stood there, unsure of what to do, while a mix of confusion, excitement, and something else I couldn't quite name swirled inside me. That fleeting moment felt like it lasted forever before I finally pulled back, trying to act casual. "Well, that wasn't what I expected," I mumbled, forcing a smile. He chuckled awkwardly, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Although I knew it was just an innocent mistake, something inside me had shifted. Something small, but important. Caleb stepped back, and his warm, sincere demeanor returned. He apologized, saying it had been a joke, but his gaze remained curious, an intensity one couldn't ignore. "See you around, Sophie," he said as he left the bakery. "I'll come by again soon." I nodded, returning to my work, but my mind was racing. What had just happened? Was it just a joke, or was there more to it? Days passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss. It was strange. It had been so brief, almost unnoticeable, and in any other situation, I'd probably have forgotten about it by now. But not this time. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the warmth of his lips on mine, the memory of his touch. This feeling inside me was growing stronger, flooding my thoughts at the most unexpected moments. Caleb began showing up at the bakery more often. His visits always seemed random, as if he were just stopping by for coffee or to buy bread. But I knew better. He had a purpose, even if he didn't say it. Maybe he didn't even know what he wanted, or maybe he was too afraid to admit it. Every time he came in, my heart raced like a teenager's. I tried to keep calm and professional, but it felt like he could see right through me. He'd smile, crack jokes, bring me fresh fruits and spices for baking. I tried to hide my enjoyment, but it was getting harder. "I brought something for your baking experiments," he said one day, grinning in a way that made my heart feel lighter. "These are rare spices. They might give your pastries a whole new flavor." "Thanks, Caleb," I replied, doing my best not to look directly into his eyes. "You're always so thoughtful." He continued talking about how long he'd searched for these spices at the market, but I felt like our conversation had shifted. It was no longer just about food or coffee. There was something more in his eyes, something that I couldn't ignore. I could feel the subtle pull of attraction between us, growing stronger with each visit. Then one day, as I was kneading dough in the kitchen, I heard the familiar bell of the bakery door ring again. I went to the front, and there he was, smiling that same smile, with that same knowing look in his eyes. "I'm having an opening for a new gallery at the end of the week," he said, casually shrugging as though it didn't matter much, though I could tell it was important to him. "Maybe you could come by and see what I've been working on?" At first, I thought about declining, but something inside me hesitated. I knew that in a small town like ours, events like these quickly became fodder for gossip. But something in the way Caleb looked at me, in the tone of his voice, this mix of casual ease and deep sincerity, made me hesitate. I felt my heart waver. "Sounds interesting," I said, doing my best not to show my excitement. "I think I'll come." "Why not?" Caleb seemed pleased with my response. We chatted a bit more about the event, and then he left, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air long after he was gone. The day of the gallery opening arrived, and I stood in front of my mirror for what felt like forever, trying to decide what to wear. I picked a dark dress that flattered my figure, though deep down I knew I was hoping to look better than usual. When I got to the gallery, the air was thick with whispers about the new exhibits, paintings, sculptures, all of it. Caleb was the center of attention. The moment I walked in, his eyes locked onto mine. I was taking in the exhibition when Nathan, a former colleague, approached me. We exchanged a few pleasantries, but before long, his questions started feeling a little too personal. "Is Ethan not here?" he asked, his tone suggesting something more beneath the surface. "No, he's tied up with work," I said, trying to keep my irritation in check. Nathan pressed on, asking about my family, and I could feel my patience starting to fray. I caught Caleb's gaze across the room, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to offer me silent support, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. He gestured for me to join him, and I eagerly seized the opportunity to leave my conversation with Nathan. We moved to a quieter corner of the gallery, where the noise of the crowd seemed to fade away. "You look a bit tense," Caleb said, studying me closely. "Everything okay?" I nodded, though inside, everything was churning. Why was I reacting this way? Why did it matter so much that I was here with him? I felt like I was drowning in my own emotions. "I'm just a bit tired," I said, my voice steady, even though everything inside me felt like it was on fire. "It's beautiful here, but maybe we should head out." He looked at me for a moment, as if weighing my words. "Of course. If that's what you want," he said, and I couldn't help but feel a small flutter of joy at his willingness to follow my lead. We stepped outside, and the cool evening air touched my face. Caleb offered me his arm, and I felt my heart quicken. I didn't know what the night would bring, but being with him felt right, and I didn't want it to end so soon. After that evening at the gallery, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had changed. Every time I replayed in my mind how we'd walked down those quiet streets, how he'd held my arm, how I'd caught glimpses of his face in the dim streetlight, a sense of something dangerous began to stir inside me. I wanted to believe it was just friendly attention, but deep down, I couldn't convince myself of that. His words, his glances, that soft yet determined kiss, it all left a mark on my heart. Caleb continued to stop by the bakery, and our conversations grew more personal with each visit. He talked about his life in Europe, his projects, and how sometimes he felt like an outsider in the art world. In turn, I found myself sharing thoughts with him that I'd never told Ethan. We talked about books, movies, and I felt like I was discovering something special in Caleb, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for a long time. One evening, just as I was finishing up at the bakery, Caleb came in right before I was about to close. I was about to tell him it was time to leave, but there was something in his demeanor. He seemed anxious, like he was searching for the right words. "Did you have a long day?" he asked. "Everything okay?" "As always," I replied, forcing a smile. "But it's just part of being a baker. How about you?" "I've had a rough week," he said, his lips biting slightly as if holding something back. "But there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." "Sophie," he said, taking a step closer. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. His eyes were intense, his expression determined. "I can't pretend anymore. There's something between us," he whispered, his voice low but firm. "I can't ignore it." I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I thought he could hear it. He took another step, and there were barely inches between us now. "Caleb." I started to speak, but my voice faltered. This isn't right," I stammered. "I have a family." "Ethan, I know," he interrupted, his voice gentle but insistent. "But you feel it too, don't you? I see it in your eyes, in your smile. Am I wrong?" My breath hitched. I didn't know how to respond. There was so much tenderness in his eyes, so much certainty that I felt as though I might drown in his gaze. "We can't," I whispered, but even to my own ears, my words didn't sound convincing. He leaned in closer, so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. He took my hand in his, and in that touch, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long. Tenderness, a connection that made my heart ache. "I understand it's complicated," he said softly, his voice low but persistent. "But I can't keep pretending anymore." And then, slowly, he leaned in and kissed me. This kiss was completely different. Deep, meaningful, and filled with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. I felt every part of me tighten with excitement, and for a moment, I let go. No thoughts, no reservations, just the feeling of his lips on mine. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. The world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of us in that one fleeting moment. Then, suddenly, I pulled away, a jolt of panic racing through me. "No," I gasped, nearly shouting as I stepped back. "This is wrong." He immediately pulled back as well, understanding he had crossed a line. But even though he stepped away, his gaze remained soft and full of empathy, a silent understanding passing between us. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he said in a calm voice. "I didn't mean to upset you. I had to do it at least once." I stayed silent, unable to find the right words to say. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and contradictions. It felt as though I had lost my footing and had no idea which direction to go in. Inside me, there was a storm, guilt, fear, and yet an inexplicable, overwhelming desire. "I need time to think," I muttered, keeping my gaze away from him. "Of course," he answered softly. "I understand, but just know this, Sophie, if you need me, I'll always be here for you." With those words, he turned slowly and left, leaving me standing alone in the empty bakery. My heart was pounding, and his words reverberated in my mind. It hit me then. I'd stepped into uncharted territory, and now there was no turning back. After that night, I tried to return to my normal life, but it felt futile. A storm had begun inside me, one I couldn't control. My heart was torn between guilt and a strange exhilaration I couldn't shake off. Every time I closed my eyes, it was Caleb I saw, his gaze, his voice, his kiss. I found myself thinking about him more often than I wanted to admit, imagining him walking into the bakery again, our hands brushing as if by accident. I knew I had to distance myself. I needed to forget. So I stopped answering his calls and messages, avoided his visits. I even persuaded Ethan to take a few days off so we could go to our country house, thinking it might help us reconnect. Ethan seemed a little surprised, maybe even pleased. He probably thought I just wanted more quality time with him. Maybe he sensed something had shifted between us, but didn't want to acknowledge it. At the country house, Surrounded by the tranquility of fields and forests, I tried to focus on the two of us. We went for walks, picked mushrooms, and spent evenings playing board games. Ethan was gentle, caring, and genuinely seemed to be trying, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just two actors playing parts in a forgotten play. When he took my hand, I felt nothing but emptiness. His hugs made me feel suffocated. One evening, Ethan finally decided to confront me. "Sophie," he started, choosing his words carefully, "you've been acting differently lately. I can tell something's off. We've drifted apart and I don't know why. Maybe we should talk." My heart started to race. I knew he was right, but I couldn't bring myself to be honest with him. "Everything's fine, Ethan," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired. There's a lot going on at work. It's all just piling up." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't push it further, though. We went to bed, and I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling in the dark, trying to figure out what I was going to do. The next morning, as we were about to head back to the city, Ethan suggested we stop by Isla's place. He needed to pick something up from her garage. I wasn't ready for the visit, but I couldn't think of a good reason to refuse. When we arrived, Isla greeted us with her usual cheerful smile, and I felt a little better while Ethan went to the garage. My sister and I sat in the kitchen, sipping tea. "You've changed, Sophie," she said casually, eyeing me closely. "Did something happen?" I shook my head, trying to hide the anxiety on my face. "No, everything's fine," I lied. "Just a lot of work." Isla continued to study me, her eyes sharp. "I ran into Caleb recently," she said, and my heart nearly stopped. "He mentioned he has someone he cares about. But he didn't seem entirely certain. He seemed a bit lost." I fought to stay calm, though inside, I was a mess. "Oh, really?" I said, trying to sound uninterested. "Well, he's always been a little strange." "Maybe," Isla agreed, but her eyes stayed fixed on me. "But, he said this woman is married." My hand started to shake, and I lowered my gaze to my cup, hoping she wouldn't notice. "Interesting. I wonder who that could be," I said, keeping my voice even. Isla smiled slightly and took a sip of her tea, as if nothing unusual had been said. But I knew she was sharp, and I felt a pang of fear. My secret was no longer safe. When we returned home, I felt completely drained, my mind swirling with thoughts. What if Isla had figured it out? What if she told Ethan? I felt like I was losing control of everything. Late that night, Ethan brought up the distance between us once more, this time more insistent. "Sophie, I think you're hiding something," he said seriously. "I know you too well to not see that something's going on." I felt my palms sweat, and fear shot through me. "No, Ethan, everything's fine." I lied again, but my voice shook. He stood up and moved closer to me. "Are you sure? Because I'm willing to do whatever it takes to understand what's going on. You know I love you, and we can work through this, as long as we're honest with each other." I looked at him, and for a moment, I wanted to tell him everything, the truth about Caleb, the feelings, the mistakes. But I couldn't. I was terrified that the truth would destroy everything we had. "I just need time, Ethan," I said quietly, struggling to hold back tears. "It'll be okay, I promise." He looked at me with sadness in his eyes, but nodded, not pressing for any more details. We went to bed in silence, and I knew deep down that I was losing him, little by little. The next day, I returned to the bakery, weighed down by a heavy heart. I knew I needed to figure things out, but I had no idea where to start. Then, through the shop window, I saw Caleb standing outside, looking straight at me. He didn't move. He just stood there, waiting. My life was falling apart, and I had no idea what would come next. When I saw him there, my heart stopped. He stood on the sidewalk, his head tilted slightly, his expression saying he was waiting for me to make the first move. His presence felt like a weight on my shoulders, yet I couldn't pull my eyes away from him. All the internal conflicts, all the doubts I'd been battling, flared up once again. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a coincidence. He was here to say something important. I tried to keep myself busy in the bakery, but my hands were shaking. I watched him shift from one foot to the other, his eyes darting around, and soon I couldn't bear it any longer. I threw the towel onto the counter and rushed to the door, feeling the anxiety building inside me. As soon as I stepped outside, the cool wind hit my face, grounding me in the reality of the moment. Caleb turned and quickly walked toward me, his eyes full of concern. "Sophie, I need to talk to you," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I need to explain." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. We walked to a nearby park, the one close to the bakery, where there weren't many people around. Autumn was just beginning to set in, and the trees were starting to turn. We sat on a bench, and I clenched my hands into fists trying to calm my nerves. "I found out you're seeing someone," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "Isla told me she saw you with another woman." Caleb looked surprised, then confused, but eventually he nodded. "Yes, I am seeing someone," he admitted, not meeting my eyes. I tried to move on, tried to forget about what happened between us, but it's not working, Sophie. I can't stop thinking about you. My heart clenched, and a surge of jealousy, one I knew I shouldn't feel, rose inside me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, the mix of anger and pain evident in my voice. "You dragged me into all this. And now what?" "Because I didn't want to lose you," he replied, locking his gaze with mine. "But I see now that I've already ruined everything. I know I've made a mistake, and you shouldn't have been dragged into this mess. But I can't help it, Sophie. I care about you, and it's driving me crazy." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I wanted was to go back in time to make sure this never happened. "Caleb, we need to stop this," I finally said, feeling something inside me snap. "I can't do this anymore. I love Ethan, but I'm confused. I don't know what to do." Caleb stared at me for what felt like an eternity, as if trying to understand what was going on inside me. Then, with a quiet sigh, he stood up from the bench. "I understand," he said, his voice bitter. "I never wanted to hurt you, Sophie. Maybe it's better if I just leave. I'll leave town. It's probably the best thing for all of us." Those words hit me like a sharp blade. "Leave forever?" I asked, but my mind was already telling me this was the right decision. Still, my heart ached at the thought of losing him. I didn't have time to say anything more before he turned and walked away quickly, leaving me standing among the first fallen leaves, feeling like the world around me had shrunk to a tiny, lonely point. When I returned to the bakery, Ethan was already there, waiting for me. He stood by the counter, holding my phone in his hand, his face tense and serious. Immediately, I knew. He knew everything. He looked at me with pain, disappointment, and anger all rolled into one. "I saw your messages, Sophie," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I read everything." My hands went slack, and I felt my legs go weak. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think of anything to say. I could only stand there, staring at him, as he continued. "How could you?" His voice broke, trembling more. "How could you do this to me? I trusted you. I loved you." Tears began to fall down my cheeks, and I felt as though everything inside me was collapsing. I wanted to explain, to tell him it was a mistake, that I was confused, but the words were stuck in my throat. "I'm sorry, Ethan," I whispered, but I knew it wasn't enough. He was silent for what felt like a lifetime before grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice quiet, exhausted. "I need time." And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the bakery, surrounded by the smell of fresh bread and the sting of spilled tears. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of it all, but everything around me felt hollow. The bakery no longer brought me any joy, and each day was filled with bitterness. Word spread quickly through the town, and customers began to avoid my shop, whispering as they passed by. Caleb had left town, just as he'd said, leaving only emptiness in my heart. And Ethan wouldn't take my calls or reply to my messages. I had lost everything: my family, my reputation, my happiness. I sat alone in the bakery, staring out the window at the cars driving by, realizing that my life would never be the same. I had destroyed everything with my own hands. Now, All I could do was watch as my world crumbled piece by piece.